Good evening. You're watching Left, Right and Centre. I'm Nidhi Razdan. It's been a particularly tense week at the line of control as India and Pakistan exchanged heavy fire, resulting in the deaths of both soldiers and civilians. That includes the second beheading of an Indian soldier in the span of less than a month. Since September 29th surgical strikes, the ceasefire violations have risen and nearly 20 Indian soldiers from both the Army and the BSF have been killed. With India and Pakistan tensions dominating the headlines, there is perhaps no one better placed to put all of this into perspective for us than India's former National Security Advisor, Mr. Shivshankar Menon, whose new book, Choices Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy, is just out. In fact, it is going to be formally launched by the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, next week. And Mr. Menon has dealt extensively with the issue of surgical strikes, what happened after 26/11, and of course with China, with Sri Lanka, and many other foreign policy choices that India has had to make, difficult ones over the past few decades. Mr. Menon, lovely to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
All these years we tried and didn't succeed, but we've got you today.
Thank you for having me.
You said something interestingly the other day, that when you were asked about the impact of surgical strikes and whether they could actually deter Pakistan, and you said that such operations will not change the minds of our adversaries. And it's just the next day that the latest killings happen, including the second beheading of this soldier. Can you expand on that? Because what you're saying is coming true. It doesn't seem to have impacted Pakistan's ability to strike at India.
Well, I think they're useful, but they have a limited utility. I mean, they won't change their minds. They won't, I think, change their behavior except in a limited way. In the past also there have been similar actions across the LOC. But the purpose of those is really to restore dominance and reduce the number of, ceasefire violations, infiltration attempts, and to lower the level of violence and to bring it back to some kind of equilibrium, a lower equilibrium. But it's not a permanent solution to the problem, because the causes of this behavior from the Pakistani side, by the jihadi tanzeems, by the Pakistan Army, are not actually eliminated by surgical strikes like this, nor do they eliminate the capacity of the terrorists to infiltrate and so on, except maybe in a limited way. You can destroy the launch pads, but then they can build new ones as well. So it has limited utility. As the point really with trying to re-establish deterrence through military means on the line of control is really that unless you can get into the minds of the state sponsors of cross-border terrorism, it's much harder to say that these actions will lead to results, will change their minds.
So what was different? I mean, there's been so much commentary about September 29th and what was different from the past. Was it that it was publicly announced? Earlier also there were reports of it. Was it that it was bigger in scale? What was different about this time?
Well, I think once it goes public, once it becomes a public issue, then obviously new factors come into play. Public opinion on both sides, the need to maintain face and prestige, and therefore the escalation ladder becomes much harder to control. Many more actors are involved. And
was it wise to go public, you think?
It's a matter of choice. I mean, you choose to do it depending on what your anticipation is. Frankly, any act like this, use of force or any other act, from a policy point of view, what you're trying to do is to create an outcome. So you have to judge whether it's useful to go public. Does it help you achieve your outcome? Depends what your outcome is. If your outcome is a limited one of restoring deterrence and lowering the level of violence on the line of control, then it's questionable whether going public helps. But you might have other outcomes in mind. You might want to score diplomatic victories, to influence public opinion at home. Those are legitimate outcomes.
Do you think we've been able to do that in the past month? Because at least diplomatically, you have, for instance, the fact that the SAARC countries, in a sense, got together and said we will not go to Islamabad for this summit. Would you say that that was an important diplomatic outcome?
I think yes, the SAARC summit is postponed. But in all these cases, I think you have to then look beyond that. What about the morning after? Then what? Do we want to bring the SAARC process back on track? Do we not? How do we go? I think that's something that the government really has to answer. Sitting outside, you can't second guess what government's objectives are. And that's really for government to stand up and say.
You also mentioned again, which of course former army chiefs have also done, which is that India has done this before. We've not announced it. Can you share with us how many times we've done it?
I think best to ask the army chiefs, and this is
not you, although you were the NSA.
I'd rather not get into the operational details of this kind of thing.
You mentioned in your book here on the chapter on 26/11 and at that time what the choices were. An interesting sentence. You said India's immediate political objective must recognize that this is a long-term conflict with Pakistan that cannot be solved, and temporarily silencing the cross-border terrorists is the best we can hope for. Some would say that sounds pretty grim. Well,
I'm afraid, I say so, that the prospect is really for a long, protracted period of low-level conflict, but still conflict nonetheless. And it's not a happy thought, I think, for us, for anybody who is, a reasonable human being. But the reason is because I think the causes of the conflict are really structural to Pakistan. That there are very strong institutional interests on the Pakistani side, Pak Army, ISI, and so on, the jihadi tanzeems, their alliance, and also other factors which make it almost impossible for Pakistan to sustain or to do what's necessary for a normal relationship with India.
So, in other words, you're saying we can never have a normal relationship with Pakistan?
No, I'm saying that things can change. I mean, Pakistan can change, the context can change, the balance of power can change, the balance of forces on the ground can change. Many things can change. But as of now, the prospect is for this to continue for some time.
How do you then look at the situation today? How do you see it going from here? The tensions we've seen along the LOC, although you have Sartaj Aziz now coming to India next week for the Heart of Asia conference. Do you think we're going back into that familiar cycle, or is there something different this time?
We've been here before, and I think for me, unfortunately, the conclusion I have come to is that there is a very strong interest on the Pakistani side, and the establishment especially, to have a sort of managed level of hostility with India. So it's not necessarily, so far at least what we've seen, doesn't suggest that they're looking for a much broader conflict, or that their goals still remain to keep it at a managed level of hostility and conflict. And that seems to serve domestic political purposes in Pakistan and the institutional interests of major actors in the Pakistan establishment.
When you wrote about 26/11, you've outlined several reasons why the government at that time chose not to ultimately strike back. And although you yourself said that you were in favor of it, that was your first instinctive reaction. And several of the things you said actually could apply to even today's scenario. You talked about how the impact, what was one of the things that weighed in was what would happen to the Indian economy at the time. The fact that even if you did a surgical strike, it may, they'll build their launch pads again, it may not make a substantial difference. Civilian casualties being collateral. And many of those things could apply today. And yet, you did say also that you felt at that time that India would probably respond differently if this happened again, and that's what's happened.
Yeah.
How do we sort of weigh that?
How do you put that together?
Yeah.
Well, I think in hindsight, I think it was probably the right decision at that time in those particular circumstances, and I think the reasons are there in the book. But as I said, if deterrence were to break down again, then clearly you would have to try and restore it. And that would require you to do some kind of kinetic action along the line, which is why I said that it's unlikely to be repeated, because that particular set of circumstances around the Mumbai attack, that set of circumstances is unlikely to be repeated exactly over again, which is why I thought in future if that were to happen again. But the whole point of writing this, actually, you say that many of the considerations are the same. The reason I wrote the book, actually, because I did a study group where I used to discuss these cases with students, and for about two hours we'd talk about these things. And I realized that there's general interest in this, not just among foreign policy wonks or diplomats or
journalists,
or journalists, but also among the general, the general student body was very interested, and they would get into this discussion, and people from across the world, from different places, would actually. And the conclusion at the end of it is that there is no right or wrong, black or white, true or false, win-lose answer to these kinds of choices that statecraft throws up. That, you have to look at the circumstances, think it through each time.
Mr. Menon, you have served in China as well, and as ambassador, and you understand China perhaps better than many diplomats. Looking at the relationship with China today and everything that's happened this year, we seem to have started off on a good note when Prime Minister Modi took over. It doesn't seem to be quite the case now at this point. For instance, on the nuclear suppliers group issue, do you think we underestimated the Chinese opposition, the Chinese hostility to this? What do you think went wrong?
Well, I think they signaled it before the membership was considered. I think they signaled it quite clearly beforehand. But I take the slightly longer view of India-China relations. If you step back a bit, for the last 30 years we've had a working modus vivendi with the Chinese. We haven't solved all our problems, but we've discussed whatever difficulties we have, whatever differences, the boundary, etc. We've let the rest of the bilateral relationship develop. Trade has grown tremendously, from $2 billion in 2003 to $72 billion last year. And we've cooperated where we could on the international stage, whether climate change, WTO, and so on. But several things have changed. China has changed, and her whole approach to the rest of the world has changed. India has changed as well. Certainly, China has expanded the definition of her core interests, and the whole context in which we're operating has changed. In the Asia-Pacific, globally, after the 2008 economic crisis. So that modus vivendi is no longer enough to keep the relationship stable and predictable. So we really need to sit and have a real strategic dialogue with the Chinese and see where we go from here. Because ultimately what we want is sensitivity to our core interests. Why are we so worried about the CPEC? Because it goes through Indian territory and it represents a huge Chinese investment.
But you see a hardening of Chinese position is my point.
Exactly. I said they've expanded their definition of their interests. The Chinese will say the same in reverse about you, but it's true. When we started reform in 91, 14% of our economy was tied to the external sector. By 2013, it was something like 49.3%. So you have a much bigger interest in, say, the South China Sea. Your trade flows through there. It affects your economic future. You have broader interests today than you did 30 years ago when you worked out this modus vivendi and when you started this. So you need to find a new equilibrium between the two, and you need to actually start understanding how to deal with it.
You've also got a chapter on nuclear deterrence and no first use, which again made headlines recently. Your book has sort of brought these issues to the fore. Manohar Parrikar,
I don't think I can claim the credit.
You can't claim the credit, but it's just a coincidence that all this has happened. Manohar Parrikar controversially saying that, about what is the need for a new first use, and then saying it was his personal opinion. You said personal opinions shouldn't be made public.
I think there should be a review, actually.
Yeah, that's what I was coming to. You said that the situation is changing rapidly and India needs to think through the alternatives.
We need to keep looking at them, because every time the situation changes, you can't keep saying, I will react exactly the same. And you need to see whether you need to adjust your reactions. So far, all three major reviews within government of no first use have come to the conclusion that no first use is really the best way forward. And I don't think that today, based on what we know of our environment and our possible adversaries, I don't think that today we need to actually change no first use, but that's my opinion. I think it's something that government needs to... But you're saying don't keep the door closed on it.
No,
I think government needs to look at it seriously and consider it, and I think that's good policy to look at it again. As of now, I don't know of anything which suggests that it needs to be changed, and I still haven't heard a credible scenario which requires first use of nuclear weapons by India. But maybe it's out there, maybe somebody else has thought of something, so therefore you need to do a review. But I don't think the way to do it is by airing private opinions in public. Private citizens like me, we can do it. But I'm not sure that, it should be aired by those who actually speak for the government at the highest level.
Well, Mr. Menon, it was wonderful to talk to you. There are a lot of issues you've touched upon in this book. My personal favorite is the India-US nuclear deal, a story I continue to be obsessed with.
You know very well.
So, thank you very much for coming today.